There's a lie a whole town can tell without ever once opening its mouth. It's told in the way conversation dies when a certain woman walks into the mercantile, in the pew that always has a little too much room around her, in the way mothers pull their children a half step closer, as though barrenness were a thing that might rub off in passing, like coal dust or bad luck. For 11 years, the town of Copperline told Adelaide Reeve that lie. She'd married young, buried a husband young, and never once carried a child in between. And out of those three plain facts, the town built a whole gospel about what she was and what she'd never be. She'll never be a mother. They said it kindly, some of them. They said it cruelly, others. But they all said it the same way people say a thing they've decided is finished. And then one gray morning in the tail of winter, a mountain came down off Halloway Ridge. Not a mountain of stone. A man built like one, snow in his beard, grief in his shoulders, and behind him, roped together against the wind like a string of half-frozen sparrows, 5 children with no mother left in the world to claim them. He didn't come to town for supplies. He came looking for a wife. And of all the doors in Copperline he could have knocked on, he chose the one nobody in that town believed had any business being a mother at all. I know this because I saw it. I saw all of it, from the first knock to the last. I wrote it down the way I write everything down, because I've never trusted my memory the way I trust ink. But some things you write down and the columns just won't balance, no matter how many times you run the figures. This is the story of the woman they said would never be a mother. I'd ask you not to decide how it ends. That was Copperline's mistake. Don't let it be yours. Stay with me, both parts, all the way up the ridge and all the way back down. The first I knew of Sela's thorn was the sound of his boots stopping outside my window, and the terrible quiet of children who have learned not to complain. I keep the ledger for Copperline, not the town's official one. That's the assessor's business, but the one that matters more if you ask me, which nobody ever does. I keep the record of the store. Who owes what? Who paid when? Who bought lamp oil in a hard month and pretended it was for reading? 41 years I've kept that book, and I've learned you can read a man's whole life in his account if you're patient. I've buried customers whose debts I quietly crossed out and told no one. I've watched marriages start and end in the space between a bolt of calico and a christening ribbon. A man learns things, keeping a book. That morning I was tallying the flour when the boots stopped, and I looked up, and the light in the window went dark the way it does when something large stands in front of the sun. He filled the doorway. He had to duck to come through it, and even ducked he seemed to have more of himself than the room could hold. His coat was elk hide gone stiff with the cold, and his beard had frost caught in it, and his eyes, I remember his eyes did a thing I've only seen in men who have been alone too long with something heavy. They moved too much. Like he'd forgotten how a room full of strangers is supposed to feel, and every corner of it might hold a threat. Behind him came the children. I counted them. I count things. It's a sickness in me, my late wife used to say, that I can't let a number go by unclaimed. 5. The oldest a girl of maybe 12, thin as a fence rail, with a face that had already given up being a child's face. 2 boys behind her, stair-stepped, 7 and 9 or thereabouts, holding hands in a way boys that age generally won't unless they're frightened. A smaller girl, 4 maybe, with a rag doll clutched so hard the stuffing had gone flat. And bundled against the oldest girl's chest, wrapped in what I later learned was a dead woman's shawl, an infant so still I thought at first it wasn't living. Nobody said a word, not the children, not the man. Cold morning to bring little ones down the ridge, I said, because somebody had to, and it's my store. He looked at me for a long moment. When he spoke his voice came out rusty, like a hinge that hasn't turned in a season. I need to know, he said, which woman in this town would take a husband she's never met. I have been asked a great many strange things across that counter. Men have asked me for poisons and love philters and where to find a preacher who wouldn't ask questions. But I'd never been asked that, plain as a request for nails, and I confess I set down my pencil. Mister, I said, That's not a question I've got in stock." He didn't smile. I don't think he had one left in him. He shifted the weight of his silence from one boot to the other, and the oldest girl behind him made a small sound, and the baby in her arms stirred and mewled, the first proof it was alive, and something crossed the mountain man's face that I can only call drowning. "Wife died," he said. "9 days back, fever after the last one." He didn't look at the baby when he said it, and that not looking told me more than looking would have. "I've got no people, she had no people. I can keep them fed, I can keep them warm most nights, but I can't." He stopped. His jaw worked, a man that size, and the words wouldn't come. "There's things a father can't do. The little one won't take goat's milk from me. My hands are wrong for it, everything about me is wrong for it. And winter's not done." And I understood him then, God help me. I understood that this was not a man come courting. This was a man who had done the arithmetic of his own life and found it came up short by exactly one, and had walked down a mountain in the last of the cold to see if there was a spare anywhere in the valley. "There's the church," I started. "Church'll take the baby," he said. "Split them up. Farm the boys out to whoever needs hands. I know how it goes. I was one of them once." His eyes did their moving thing again. "I promised her I wouldn't let them go separate. On her." He couldn't finish it. He didn't have to. I closed the ledger. I don't know why I did it, except that some conversations you can't have with a book open in front of you. "Sit down," I told him. "You and yours. There's a stove in the back, and I've got yesterday's bread I was going to feed the birds." The oldest girl's head came up at the word bread, quick and then ashamed of itself, and that quickened shame did something to my old chest I wasn't ready for. "Sit down, mister." "Thorn," he said. "Silas Thorn." "Josiah Bell," I said. "Sit down, Silas Thorn, and let me think on it. There might be one." There was one. God forgive me, I knew who she was before I'd finished saying the words. I'd known before he asked. Some part of me, the part that keeps the book, the part that can't let a number go by, had already put the two of them in the same column and seen, with a kind of dread, how neatly they might add. Now I have to tell you about Adelaide Reeve, and I have to tell it right, because the town never did. She came to Copperline as a bride at 19, on the arm of a man named Tom Reeve who ran cattle out on the flats east of town. Pretty in a quiet way, not the kind that turns a room, the kind you don't notice you've been watching until she's gone. She had a way of listening that made you feel your dull complaints were worth the airing. She'd stand at my counter, and I'd tell her about my rheumatism like it was news from the capital, and she'd nod like it was. Tom Reeve was thrown from a green horse in her second year of marriage and lived 4 days after with his skull wrong, and she nursed him every hour of those 4 days. And when he died, she was 21, and there was no child. That was the whole crime. There was no child. I've thought about it a great deal in the years since, the way a town decides a woman's worth by her belly. Tom was dead 2 years before the talk really set its teeth in. Some other woman might have gone home to family, remarried, moved on to a town that didn't know her figures. Addie stayed. She took in mending and washing. She nursed the sick when the doctor was 2 days' ride and not coming. She sat up with the dying and laid out the dead when nobody else could stand to, and every one of those good works the town accepted with one hand and slapped her with the other. Poor thing. Never could give Tom a child. Something wrong in her, they say. A woman like that, well, it's not natural, is it? A woman with no little ones always around everyone else's. I heard it in my own store. I heard women she'd nursed say it. I heard it and I said nothing, and that's a debt of mine I never could cross out. By the time Silas Thorn came down the ridge, Adelaide Reeve was 32, and she had made herself so small and so useful and so unthreatening that the town had almost stopped noticing her at all, which I believe was the point. She lived alone in a 2-room house at the end of Mercy Street, with a garden she coaxed out of poor soil, and a gray cat she talked to, and a lamp she kept burning later than a woman living alone should have to. And she had never once, in all those 11 years, said a word against the town that judged her. I used to think that was weakness. I have since revised the figure. It takes a strength I don't have, to be judged wrongly by everyone you know and go on carrying their sick children up your steps anyway. That was the woman I put in the column next to Sela's thorn. I sent the boy who sweeps for me to fetch her, with a message that I needed her at the store on a matter of business. I didn't tell her the nature of it. I'm not proud of that. I told myself she'd not come if she knew, and I'd have been right, but that's a reason, not an excuse. She came within the hour in her good gray dress because I'd said business, with her mending basket on her arm in case I meant sewing. She stepped through the door and saw the children first. She always saw children first, and I watched her whole face change. Not to pity. Pity has a softness that's mostly about the person feeling it. This was something else. This was a woman doing an inventory. Her eyes went from the frostbitten little girl to the boy's cracked lips to the terrible stillness of the baby. And by the time she reached Sela's thorn's face she had already, I swear it, decided something. "These children haven't eaten proper in days," she said. "Not to me. Not to him. To the room, the way you'd state a fact that has to be dealt with before any other business can proceed." "No, ma'am," said Sela's. She set down her mending basket. She never picked it up again that day. I've turned this next part over more times than I can count, trying to see it plain. What happened was that Adelaide Reeve did not ask a single question about herself. She asked about the baby, how old, how long off the breast, whether it took anything at all. She asked about the little girl's cough. She asked the oldest, the 12-year-old, whether she'd been the one keeping them all going since their mother passed. And the girl's chin came up hard and defiant, and then crumpled all at once. And Addie crossed the room and took that half-grown girl into her arms, and the girl, who was too old to cry, cried like the child she hadn't been allowed to be. And over the top of her head, Adelaide Reeve looked at Sela's thorn with an expression I have never found the right word for. It wasn't love, not yet. It would be unfair to them both to call it that. It was recognition, like two people who have been carrying the same weight up two different sides of the same mountain, meeting at the top, and each seeing the other's raw hands. We got the children fed. That took the better part of an hour, and Addie ran it like a field surgeon, bread soaked soft for the little ones. Small amounts often, water first. The baby coaxed with sugar teat, and goat's milk warmed on my stove while she held it against her own chest for the heat. That baby, that still and silent baby, took the milk from her. It fussed and rooted and took it, and Sela's thorn stood by the window with his back to us all, and his great shoulders were shaking, and no one said anything about it. It was only after, with the children drowsing in a heap by the stove like a litter, that Sela's said the thing out loud, to her direct. "I came down to find a wife," he said. "I won't lie to you and call it a courtship. I've got nothing to court with. I've got a cabin 2 days' hard ride up, and 5 children and 40 acres of rock, and a debt to a dead woman I can't pay except by keeping them together." He looked at his own hands. "I heard there might be a woman here who the town didn't have use for. I thought maybe 2 people with no use to anyone might be some use to each other." I winced. It was a cruel thing to say, and he didn't mean it cruel, and Addie knew the difference. I could see she did. But I braced for her to be wounded by it. A woman the town has no use for. 11 years of that said to her face by a stranger. She wasn't wounded. Or if she was, she'd long ago learned to set the wound aside for later, when there was time. "They told you I can't have children," she said, flat, getting it on the table. "They told me you never did." "That's a different thing." "I know it is." He met her eyes when he said it, and I'll give the mountain man this much, he didn't flinch from her. "I've got 5 already. I'm not looking for more. I'm looking for someone to help me not lose the ones I've got." The room was very quiet. The stove ticked. The gray light in the window had gone gold with afternoon. The baby sighed in its sleep, a small animal sound, and Adelaide Reeve looked down at it in her arms. She'd never once put it down, all afternoon, and I saw her make the decision she'd probably made an hour before and only now let herself feel. "I'd need a day," she said, to close up my house and settle what I owe. Josiah here can tell you my accounts are clean." "They are," I said. My voice came out strange. "And I'd want it understood," she went on, and here her voice got the smallest tremor in it, the only crack she showed the whole day, "that if I go up that mountain and give these children my whole heart, and it turns out you're a hard man, or a drinking man, or a man who raises his hand, I'll not stay to be diminished. I've been diminished 11 years down here. I won't climb a mountain for more of it." "I'm not that man," Silas said. "Everybody's not that man until they are." He took that and nodded slow. "Then you'll see," he said. "I've got no way to prove it but time." And Adelaide Reeve, whom the whole town had buried alive under a lie about her body, looked at a stranger and 5 children who needed exactly the thing everyone said she could never give, and she said, "Then I'll take the time, I'll come. I want to tell you that Copperline rose up glad for her, that the town that had wronged her 11 years saw a good woman given a second chance and wished her joy of it. It did not. Word got out by evening. Word always does, in a town that size, and the boy who sweeps for me has a mother with a mouth on her. And by the next morning when Addie came to settle her account and say her goodbyes, there was already a version going around that had nothing to do with what I'd watched with my own eyes. Adelaide Reeves run off with a mountain savage, sold herself for a roof. What kind of woman marries a man she met on a Tuesday? Well, a woman with no better prospects, that's what kind. A woman no decent man in 11 years would have. And now she's to raise another woman's bobbies, her that couldn't raise her own, those poor motherless things. God help them, handed to her. I heard it, and this time I didn't hold my tongue. I'm an old man and I've made my money, and there's a freedom in that. I said, loud in my own store, to a woman I won't name who was enjoying the tale too much. "I was there. You weren't. That woman fed 5 starving children with her own hands while you were home minding your own comfort. You want to talk about what kind of woman she is, you talk about that. It didn't help. It never does. But I've found you have to say the true thing anyway, even when it doesn't help, because the not saying is how the lie got so big in the first place. That's my one contribution to 11 years of Adelaide Reeve. One sentence, 11 years late. She came to me before she left. Just her, early, the children still sleeping at the boarding house Silas had scraped up the coin for. She wanted to settle her book and, I think, to say goodbye to the one place in Copperline that had never quite joined the chorus against her. "You think I'm a fool, Josiah," she said. "It wasn't a question." "I think," I said carefully, "that you're doing a braver thing than this town has ever done, and it'll never once thank you for it." She smiled at that, tired. "I don't need thanking. I've done without thanking a long time." She looked out my window up toward the gray shoulder of Halloway Ridge where the clouds sat on the mountain like they meant to stay. "You know what they never understood down here. All those years they pitied me for being empty. I was never empty. I was just full of a thing I had nowhere to put." Her hand went, without her seeming to notice, to the front of her dress over her heart, the exact gesture a nursing mother makes. "I've been carrying a mother around inside me for 30 years with no child to give her to. They thought that made me less. It only made me heavy. I didn't have anything to write in the ledger for that. Some things you can't put in a column. That baby," she said, "the little one. She hasn't got a name yet. Did you know that? Their mother died before she could name her, 9 days old and no name." Addie's eyes shone, but she didn't let the tears go. She'd had a lifetime's practice. "I'm going to name her. First thing when we're settled, I'm going to give that child a name." She said it like a vow, like the most important thing she'd ever do. Maybe it was. They left at mid-morning. Silas Thorne walked, leading a mule packed with what Addie's whole life had shrunk down to 2 trunks, the mending basket, a gray cat in a slatted crate yowling its outrage at the world. The 4 older children walked strung out around him. And Adelaide Reeve rode the one horse, because she was the one holding the baby, and she rode up out of Copperline with a nameless infant against her heart, and did not look back at the town that had spent 11 years telling her what she'd never be. I watched them till the road bent behind the Coghlan place and I couldn't see them anymore. Then I went inside and opened my book and tried to balance the day's flour against the day's coin, and I sat there a long while with the pencil not moving, because, for the first time in 41 years of keeping accounts, I could not, for the life of me, make the columns come right. Something had gone up that mountain that I had no figure for. And I would not know, for the whole long turn of a season, whether it was going to come back down alive. The mountain does not answer letters. I want that understood before I tell the rest, because you might reasonably ask how a storekeeper in a valley town came to know what happened in a cabin 2 days' ride up Halloway Ridge. The truth is I didn't, not for a long while, and the not knowing near drove me to distraction. I'm a man who likes his accounts current, and here I'd invested, there's no other word for it, in the fate of a good woman, and the mountain took her and gave me nothing back but weather. Winter came down off the ridge like it had a grudge. The worst in 20 years, the old-timers said, and the old-timers always say that, but this once they were right. The pass closed in December. Snow to the second-story windows in town. God knew what it was up on the ridge. I'd stand at my window some evenings and look up at that white shoulder of mountain going blue in the dusk, and think about a woman up there among strangers' children, with a hard man she'd known for one afternoon, and I'd think, I sent her there. My one sentence 11 years late, and then I loaded her onto a horse and sent her into that. What I know of the winter I learned after in pieces, mostly from Addie herself and some from the oldest girl, whose name I should tell you now. Wren. 12 years old and running a household of grief since her mother's last breath. It's Wren I have to thank for the part of this I couldn't have seen, because Wren, it turned out, kept a record too. She scratched the days on the inside of the woodshed door with a nail, the way prisoners do, so she'd know how long the winter was lasting. A girl after my own heart keeping her book. When I finally met her months on, I told her so, and she looked at me like I was simple and said, "Everybody counts the bad days. Only reason to. 12 years old." Here is what happened up the mountain. I'll tell it as near to true as the pieces allow. It went hard at the start. Of course it did. The children did not want her. Why would they? A strange woman in their dead mother's kitchen, using their dead mother's pots, singing, when she finally dared to sing songs their dead mother never sang. The little 4-year-old, whose name was Posy, took to Addie fast, the way the very young will latch onto warmth. She'd follow Addie room to room dragging that flat rag doll, and she started calling her mama within the fortnight, and every time she did it one of the older ones would leave the room. The boys, Caleb, 9, and Tam, 7, met her with the sullen truce of children who have decided to endure a thing rather than accept it. They did their chores when Silas told them to, and not when Addie asked. They ate her cooking and made a point of not thanking her. Tam wet the bed and was savage with shame about it, and it was Addie who figured out to change the sheets in the pre-dawn dark without a word to anyone, so the boy could keep his dignity, and it was months before Tam understood why he never got scolded for a thing he was sure he'd be scolded for, and by the time he understood it he loved her, though he'd have died before saying so. And Wren was the hard one. Wren had been the mother 9 days on, and she was not about to be relieved of a post she'd bled for by some valley woman the town below had cast off. She'd heard the talk before they left. Children always hear the talk, and she flung it once in the second week in the worst moment, when the baby wouldn't stop crying and Addie was bone tired and had asked Wren, just asked, to fetch more wood. "You can't even have your own," Wren said. 12 years old, and she reached right for the softest place and drove the knife in. "Everybody down there knows it. You're broken. That's why you had to come up here and steal ours, because nobody'd ever let you keep any of your own." The cabin went silent. Silas, Addie told me, half rose from his chair, not to strike. He wasn't that man, but to send the girl out to defend his new wife. And Addie put her hand on his arm and stopped him. And she set the crying baby down in its cradle, and she crossed to where Wren stood shaking with her own cruelty, braced for a slap she probably wanted, because a slap would have proved she was right. Addie knelt down to the girl's height, and she said, "I have this from Addie word for word, because she said it was the truest thing she ever said in her life. You're right, I never could have my own. 11 years I wanted to, and I never could, and every soul in that valley reminded me of it daily, and it near hollowed me out. So I know something about the thing you're feeling right now, Ren, better than you'd credit. I know what it is to have a mother love in you and no one who'll take it. That's what you've got. You loved your mama so hard you tried to be her at 12 years old, and it's breaking you, and you're furious at me because I've come to take the one thing that's been holding you together. I'm not here to steal you. I couldn't if I tried. Nobody takes a mother's place. There isn't a place, there's just room. I'm asking for room. That's all, not hers. Mine." Ren did not answer. Ren turned and went out for the wood and stayed out in the cold a long time, longer than fetching wood takes, and when she came back her eyes were raw and she didn't look at anyone, and she set the wood down by the stove, and then Addie said this was the moment, the hinge of the whole winter. Ren picked up the crying baby, competent, practiced, the way she'd done for 9 desperate days, and she brought it to Addie and put it in her arms and said, thick and furious and defeated and 12. "She likes it better when you hold her. I don't know why you should hold her." And that was the beginning of the room. The baby. I have to tell you about the baby, because that's where the whole thing turns, and it's the part I still can't set down without stopping. Addie named her as she'd vowed. She named her in the first week, before any of the peace had come, when the children still hated her, and the wind was screaming down the chimney, and there was every reason in the world to think the whole desperate gamble was going to fail. She named her one night by the fire holding her, and she chose the name Grace, not, she told me, out of any piety, but because grace was the word for a thing you're given that you haven't earned and can't repay, and that, she said, was what this squalling scrap of a child was to her. Unearned, unrepayable, grace. Grace was sickly. The dead mother's fever had touched her, or the hard birth had, or simply the 9 days of near starvation before Addie warmed the first milk into her at my stove. She was small and she was slow to thrive, and Addie sat up with her more nights than not through that killing winter, walking the cabin floor, singing the songs the dead woman never sang, willing warmth and life into a child that was not hers, and was more hers than anything had ever been. In February, Grace took a lung fever. I know about February from Silas, who told me the whole of it once, months later, standing at my counter with his hat in his hands, in the flat, exhausted voice of a man recounting a thing he'd survived but not recovered from. The child burned. 3 days and nights she burned, and the pass was closed, and there was no doctor within reach of any prayer, and there was nothing to be done but the old things, the cool cloths, the steam, the walking, the watching. And Adelaide Reeve, who had wanted a child for 30 years and been told she'd never have one, and had finally been handed one 9 days old and named her Grace, sat in a mountain cabin and watched that child try to die. She did not sleep. Silas said she would not be made to sleep, would not give the child over even to him, would not stop the walking and the cooling and the low, endless singing. On the 3rd night the fever crested and Grace went limp and gray and stopped taking anything, and Silas said he was sure, the baby was gone, and he reached to take the little body from his wife so she wouldn't have to feel it go cold in her arms. And Addie would not give her up. She held that child through the worst of it, and she talked to her, not prayers, Silas said, though he supposed it amounted to the same. She talked to her like arguing, like a woman with a debt to collect. He remembered some of it. She said, "No, no, you don't. You are not doing this. I waited 30 years for you. 30 years they told me I'd never, and here you are, and you don't get to be a lie they told me. You are mine. You are the proof they were wrong. You don't get to die and make them right." And somewhere in the black bottom of that night, the child took a breath, and then another. And the fever broke, and by dawn Grace was sweating and pink and mewling and rooting for milk. And Adelaide Reeve, who had not slept in 3 days, put her to the breast that had no milk to give and let her suckle for the comfort of it, and wept, finally, finally, after 11 years of dry-eyed endurance in a town that gave her nothing to weep for that was worth the water, wept like the mountain snow was melting all at once. Wren was awake. Wren saw it. Wren, who'd said you're broken, you can't even have your own. And Wren came across that cold cabin floor in the gray dawn and put her arms around the strange woman and the saved baby both, and the two of them held Grace between them. And the boys woke to the sound of it, and Posy came dragging her flat doll. And Silas Thorne stood in the door of his own cabin and watched 6 people he loved fold together around a life that had refused to end. And the mountain man wept too. And there was, for that one dawn, no such thing in the world as a motherless child. The pass opened in April. I knew it had opened because Silas Thorne walked into my store on a Tuesday in the last week of that month, and I looked up and there was the mountain in my doorway again, ducking under the frame. But he was changed. The frantic moving thing his eyes did was gone. He'd put on flesh. They all had, I'd learn. He stood square in the world now, like a man who knew what he was for. "I owe you," he said, "for the bread, that first day, and the milk." "You owe me nothing," I said, and my old voice cracked on it. "How is she? How are they? Man, don't make me pull it out of you. I've had a winter of not knowing." And Silas Thorne, who I never once saw smile that first gray day, smiled. Slow, like sun coming over a ridge. "She's outside," he said. "She wanted to see you first. All of them did. But she said you were the one soul in this town that never made her feel like less, and she wanted to walk in on her own feet and let you see." I came around my counter, faster than these old knees have moved in years. They were in the road outside my store, all of them. The boys, Caleb and Tam, brown and strong and squabbling over who'd hold the mule. Posy on the boardwalk, still dragging that doll, but taller, sturdier, singing to herself. Wren stood a little apart with her arms crossed, guarding, always guarding, but there was a peace worked into her face now that no 12-year-old should have had to earn and had earned anyway. And Adelaide Reeve stood in the middle of the road in the April light, with a baby on her hip. Grace, fat now, fat and pink and gnawing her own fist and looking around at Copperline with the bright suspicious eyes of a child who has never once, in her whole remembered life, gone hungry or cold or unheld. On Addie's hip like she'd grown there, like there'd never been any question. Like the whole 11 years of she'll never be a mother had been erased by the plain fact of this fat and furious and thriving child who did not know she was supposed to be an orphan. The whole street had stopped. I want you to know that. Copperline had stopped to look, because word had of course gone round, the Thorns are down off the ridge, the Reeve woman with them. And half the town found reason to be on the main road that afternoon, to see how it had turned out, to see, I suspect, whether it had gone the way they'd all so confidently predicted. It had not gone the way they predicted. Adelaide Reeve walked down the center of the town that had buried her alive, with a mother's child on her hip and 4 more strung around her, and a mountain of a husband at her back, and she was not smaller than that town anymore. She was not useful and unthreatening and folded up into a shape they'd allow. She walked tall and she walked slow, and she let every soul on that street get a good long look at the lie they'd told, made flesh and put to shame. She stopped in front of me. Up close I could see the winter on her. She was thinner in the face, older. There were lines that hadn't been there in the fall. Grief and cold and 3 sleepless nights over a dying child will do that. But her eyes had a thing in them I'd never seen in 11 years of watching her cross my store. They were full. That thing she'd told me about, the mother she'd carried around inside her for 30 years with nowhere to put it, it had somewhere to go now. You could see it had found its channel. A face that's finally allowed to pour out what it's been holding looks different from every other face in the world. "Josiah," she said. "Addie," I managed. She shifted the baby on her hip. "This is Grace," she said. "She had a hard February, she's better now." And then quiet just for me with the ghost of that tired old smile. "They said I'd never, Josiah, do you remember? The whole valley said it, every one of them my whole life." She looked down at the child and the child grabbed her nose and she let it. I think about that some nights, how sure they all were, how sorry they all were for me. She looked back up, and there was no bitterness in it at all, which was the part that undid me. No bitterness, only a kind of vast and quiet wonder. They were so sure they knew what I was. I didn't trust my voice. I'm an old man and I've buried a wife, and I don't weep in my own doorway in front of half the town. I did that day. I'm not ashamed of it. They were wrong, I said. They were wrong, she agreed. And she said it gently. She said it like forgiveness, which the town did not deserve and which she extended anyway, because that, I have come to believe, was always the truest thing about Adelaide Reeve. Not that she endured the lie, though she did, but that when it was finally over she chose not to become it in return. Grace fussed. Addie bounced her automatic, that oldest gesture in the world, and murmured something into the baby's hair, and the baby settled. And up and down the main street of Copperline, the town that had been so sure of everything stood in the April sun and had, for once, absolutely nothing to say. I've kept the ledger 4 more years since that day. The thorns come down off the ridge every spring when the pass opens, and every spring I've watched them. Caleb's near a man now and works the pack trade down to the valley. Tam grew out of his troubles. Posey's in school in town 3 seasons of the year and boards with the Coglins, and she still, at 9, carries the flattened remains of that rag doll, and I have never once heard her called motherless. Wren married last autumn, a good boy from over the far ridge. She asked Addie to stand up with her at the wedding, in the place a mother stands, and Addie did, and I was there. And I watched a girl who once said, "You're broken. You can't even have your own turn," to the woman who'd raised her the back half of her childhood and hand her the flowers to hold, the way a daughter does. And there wasn't a dry eye in that little mountain church except mine. And mine only because I'd already done my weeping over that family and had, I told myself, none left. I had some left, turned out I had more. And Grace. Grace is 5 now, and she is the loudest, fiercest, most thoroughly beloved child in the whole of Halloway Ridge. And she does not know, how could she, that there was ever a February when she nearly went, or a valley that once said the woman she calls Mama would never be one. She calls her Mama. She's never called her anything else. There's no version of the world to Grace where Adelaide Reeve is not her mother. That's the whole miracle of it. When you get down to the arithmetic, that a lie a whole town was so sure of, a thing they said so long and so confidently that it near became the truth, was undone completely and forever by one small child who simply never learned it, and never will. I keep meaning to write it all down proper in the book, the whole account of it, start to finish, so it's set down true and the town's version doesn't win by being the only one on paper. But every time I sit to it, I find I can't make it balance. There's a thing that went up that mountain in the last of a hard winter, and a thing that came down in April, and they are not the same thing, and no column I know how to keep has a place to put the difference. I think the difference is this, and then I'll close the book. They said she'd never be a mother. They were only ever counting the wrong thing.